Good afternoon, everybody in Canada, and good morning, everybody in Australia. On behalf of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, I'd like to welcome Julian Cribb. This is the third time we've had the pleasure of having Julian present some of his ideas to us. He's going to be talking today mostly about the chemicals which we are releasing all over the place, is effectively putting ourselves into a chemical bath. And he, as well as I, as a longtime ecologist and follower of this topic, are very concerned about what this entails and what it means for both us and other species that live on the planet. So over to you, Julian.
Thank you, Dave. Ladies and gentlemen, Earth and all life on it are being saturated with human-emitted chemistry in an event unlike anything that has occurred in all 4 billion years of our planet's history. Each moment of our lives, from conception to death, we are exposed to thousands of substances, some lethal even in tiny doses, and most of them unknown in their effects on our health and on our well-being or upon the natural world. These enter our bodies with each breath, every meal, the clothes we wear, the products we adorn ourselves with, our homes, our workplaces, our furniture, our cars, the things we encounter every single day. There is no escaping them. And this has all taken place in the space of a single lifetime, so rapidly that many are conscious of, well, while many are conscious of specific issues like pesticides or air pollution, most people have little notion of the universal spread of contamination, the colossal volumes involved, or the multiple impacts which tens of thousands of contaminants acting in combination may be having on our bodies and on our minds, or of the risks that this now poses to human life and to all life on Earth. Humanity currently manufactures over 350,000 different chemicals and produces countless more unintentionally. US Department of Health states that around 85,000 chemicals are regularly used in that country alone. And each year, an estimated 2,000 new ones are introduced for use in everyday substances such as foods, personal care products, prescription drugs, household cleaners, and lawn care products. The UN Environment Programme cautions that very few of these chemicals have ever been properly tested for health or environmental safety. Global output of industrial chemicals has more than doubled since 2000. It's now about 2.5 billion tonnes a year, and that is forecast to triple by the mid-century. However, these purposefully designed substances are the mere tip of the iceberg of total human emissions. Every year, we're also generating 11 billion tonnes of garbage, which is all consists of chemicals, 150 million tonnes of nitrogen, and 11 million tonnes of phosphorus, mainly from agriculture and burning fossil fuels and waste disposal, 400 million tonnes of hazardous wastes, including 50 million tonnes of old computers and phones, and this has grown from 1 million tonnes in just 25 years. 15 billion tonnes of coal, oil, and gas, contributing the lion's share of 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide gas. 72 billion tonnes of minerals, metals, and materials. Around about 150 to 1 trillion tonnes of rock, soil, tailings, overburden, acid runoff, and slags from mining. 75 billion tonnes of topsoil, mainly displaced by farming and development. Now, all of these emissions have chemical consequences for air, for land, for water, for people, and for life on Earth. This chemical tsunami, conservatively estimated at between 200 and 400 gigatons per year, constitutes by far the greatest impact that humans are having on the planet and its life in the Anthropocene. It is 5 times the scale of our climate emissions. In its sheer size and global ramifications, it is the most underrated, under-investigated, and poorly understood of the 10 catastrophic threats that now face humanity in the 21st century. Science documents man-made chemicals moving relentlessly around the Earth. These substances move constantly in both space and time, in a phenomenon that I'm terming the global chemical circulation. They travel on the wind, in water, attached to soil particles, in dust, in plastic fragments, in wildlife, in food, in drink, and traded goods, in and on actual people. They combine and recombine with one another and with naturally occurring substances, giving rise to generations of new compounds, some more toxic, others less so, most totally unknown. They leapfrog around the planet in cycles of absorption and re-release, which is known as the grasshopper effect. Many of these substances, especially heavy metals, last for centuries, creating a cumulative toxic load in the environment and in our bodies. Their poisonous effects are even now being passed on to future generations in our genes. Researchers have found man-made toxins in the stratosphere, on the peak of Mount Everest, where fresh snow is too polluted to drink, in the Amazon jungles, the remotest atolls, the continental shelves, to the ocean deeps, from the high Arctic to the pristine Antarctic, in the filthy grey-brown cloud of toxins and particulates that has settled across industrial Asia from Mecca to New Delhi to Beijing. This is the global chemical circulation. And this is a new phenomenon. It has not been studied scientifically properly. Cancer-causing flame retardants and the mercury emitted by coal burning have been found by researchers in wild birds, fish, seals, whales, deep-sea squid, polar bears, and in life forms in the remotest corners of the world where they have never come into direct contact with human beings. These substances are routinely detected throughout the global food chain, in drinking water from rivers and aquifers beneath our cities and farms, in the very air we breathe, especially indoors. Worldwide, more than 760 dead zones comprising 1/10 of the world's oceans have been identified so far. These are places where the oxygen has been stripped and sea life lost due to warming and the outpouring of fertilizers, sediments, pesticides, and oil spills. Half of the world's largest living organism, the Great Barrier Reef, was lost in the last 30 years, and 93% of the remainder has suffered dire effects from human chemical insults. 14 million tons of plastic enter the world's oceans every year, gradually reducing into teeming particles that concentrate up the food chain and through sea life, and so enter our own bodies and our brains. Tests indicate that the typical modern citizen is a walking contaminated site. The US Centers for Disease Control, for example, conducts an annual survey of 212 chemicals of concern, 212 out of 85,000, wow, in a sample of 2,000 Americans. It found flame retardants in the blood of almost every person it looked at. BPA from plastic drink bottles in more than 90%, and the non-stick chemical coating, PFOA, in most individuals. We are all poisoned by the polluted air we breathe, whether outdoors, indoors, or in our cars. Many of these poisons are delivered in so-called personal care products, such as cosmetics, fragrances, and cleaning agents, most of which are made from fossil fuels. And when we get sick from the chemical overload, our doctors then prescribe more chemicals, also mostly made from fossil fuels, to treat us. The Environmental Working Group in independent tests found 414 industrial toxins in the blood of people ranging in age from newborns to grandparents. It found 232 industrial chemicals, including dioxins, flame retardants, and known carcinogens in the blood of newborn infants of minority ethnic groups, who were contaminated while still in the womb. The very first poo that a baby takes after it is born is loaded with thousands of microscopic pieces of plastic. It has acquired these through its mother. Thereafter, the baby continues to shit the plastic it has ingested from its drinking bottles, its blankets, its synthetic clothing, its pacifiers, its eating utensils, its toys. The World Health Organization reports the finding of toxic contaminants, mainly pesticides, in the mother's milk in 68 different countries, with the highest levels in India, Egypt, the Netherlands, and Belgium. An American study found traces of rocket fuel in every commercial sample of infant formula that it tested. Explain that one to me. After weaning, the assault continues. Around 4,000 to 6,000 different chemicals, mostly pesticides, preservatives, additives, and dyes, are regularly used in the growing, processing, and packaging of modern industrial food. Many of these have not been assessed for safety, especially in children, and nobody can say what their combined effect on human health is. Those effects are literally cradle to grave. An Australian study shows that even when dead and buried, we give back our accumulated persistent toxins to future generations as they leach out of our tissues into groundwater. The World Health Organization and UNEP estimate that about 13.7 million people die every year from environmental poisons, and we lose another 600 million years of healthy life every year due to chemical exposures. Now, that does not include several million people who die of cancer, where chemicals are implicated, or lethal cases of heart disease, obesity, brain disorders, and so on. The WHO therefore estimates that 1 in 4 deaths worldwide is now due to chemical exposure in our environment, sometimes acute, but mostly chronic.
Julian, you've gotten muted somehow.
The World Health Organization and UNEP estimate that about 13.7 million people die from environmental poisons every year, and we lose 600 million years of healthy life to chemical toxification. This does not include several million cases of cancers, heart disease, obesity, and brain disorders that are also chemical related. WHO estimates that 1 in every 4 deaths now are due to chemical exposures in our environment, sometimes acute, but mostly chronic. And this far exceeds the annual tolls from malaria, car crashes, HIV, AIDS, and other common causes of death. This is the worst case of preventable homicide in human history. It is twice as bad as World War II. Yet little or nothing is being done to prevent it. The full impact of this universal chemical suffusion is not yet clear, but suspicions are firming. Medical science is now reporting unexplained increases in previously unknown or once rare conditions, whose modern upsurge is increasingly linked by researchers to rising cases of multiple chemical exposure across the entire population. Such conditions include many forms of cancer, diabetes, obesity, child development disorders, reproductive disorders, brain and nerve diseases, multiple chemical sensitivities, chronic fatigue syndrome, heart disease. In 2006 and again in 2014, Harvard professors Philippe Grandjean and Philip Landrigan warned in The Lancet of a silent pandemic of neurotoxicity affecting millions of children worldwide. The point is that the child's brain is at its most vulnerable between the ages of 2 and 5. If you hit them then with a neurotoxin, that is when you can do lifelong damage. They noted that at least 200 chemicals are now known to cause this effect, and that untested chemicals, I'm quoting, should not be presumed to be safe, to brain development and chemicals in existing use, and all new chemicals must therefore be tested for developmental neurotoxicity. Backing up their hypothesis was the finding by the US Centers for Disease Control that 1 in 6 US children now suffers from a developmental disorder, and 1 in every 44 is autistic. Several epidemiological studies find that mothers living in industrial areas close to heavy traffic are twice as likely to have an autistic child as those living in healthier places. Reducing these risks could save the life of 1 child in 4 who currently dies of an environmental poison. Worldwide, 1 person in 8 now suffers from a mental disorder, according to WHO. In a report on endocrine disrupting chemicals, the World Health Organization and UNEP warned that reproductive and other hormonal disorders are on the rise globally, that man-made substances are implicated by more and more laboratory studies, and that the scale of the problem is underestimated. Sperm counts in Western men have more than halved. Reduced female fertility, adverse pregnancy outcomes, genital deformities, changes in gender and sexual preference are all now thought to have links to man-made chemicals, the United Nations warns. Endocrine disruptors are also linked in several scientific studies with the worldwide pandemic in obesity. In other words, we're getting our metabolism scrambled by these hormone disruptors. Ominously for the human future, several studies now point to a 13% decline in human IQ since the 1970s. Although no clear cause has yet been assigned, man-made neurotoxins affecting the brain are likely suspects. 2 vital points emerge. First, a universal chemical assault of this scale is quite new. Mainly, it has just happened in the last 50 years. It is something that our ancestors never faced. Second, its impacts are for the most part preventable and avoidable. The question is, does society wish to avoid them, or do we simply not care? Each year, around 2,000 new chemicals are released onto world markets, most without proper health, safety, or environmental screening. Regulation has so far banned just 19 out of 350,000 known chemicals in a handful of countries. At such a rate of progress, it will take 1/3 years to clean up the world, country by country and chemical by chemical. So clearly, national regulation holds few answers to what is now an out-of-control global problem. Furthermore, the chemical industry is relocating out of the developed world and into developing countries where it is largely beyond the reach of the law. However, its toxic emissions return to citizens in well-regulated countries in wind, water, food, wildlife, consumer goods, industrial products, and people. Furthermore, the chemicals we emit, intentionally and unintentionally, then go on to interact with tens of thousands of other compounds in our environment and daily intake to form billions of toxic mixtures. The effects of these mixtures are poorly understood by science and cannot be controlled by regulation. The world awakened to the threat of chemical contamination when Rachel Carson published Silent Spring over half a century ago in 1962, when she warned especially about persistent pesticides used in agriculture. And we're seeing a repeat of that concern with the PFAS issues. Since her book came out, the volume of agricultural pesticide use worldwide has increased tenfold to around 5 million tons of specialized poisons per year. Chemicals and minerals are valuable and extremely useful. They do great good. They save many lives and much money. No one is suggesting they should all be banned. But their value may count for little if the current uncontrolled, unmonitored, unregulated, and unconscionable mass release and planetary saturation continues. Since the poisoning of the people of Minamata in Japan with toxic mercury in the 1950s, there has been a string of high-profile chemical scandals. The Love Canal, Seveso, Bhopal, Flixborough, Hinckley, more recently Fukushima, Tianjin, Jilin, Flint, and Beirut. One thing these events mostly have in common is that the onus of proof is on the victims to prove that they have been harmed, and how. Rarely, if ever, are industry and government held accountable or obliged to prove that their chemical processes are safe or harmless. Consequently, there is now a pattern of unproductive confrontation between angry, frightened citizens and industry and regulators. This leads to long drawn-out legal battles that deliver justice to nobody. An important point in my book is that blaming industry and calling for tougher regulation will not solve the problem of the poisoned planet. We need a smarter way to protect society and all future generations against the toxic flood. And this starts with recognizing that we are the ones who are responsible. We are the ones who generate the market signals that lead to the mass production and the ill-considered release of toxins. Every act of consumption on a crowded planet has chemical consequences. Every dollar we spend sends a signal to a string of industries which emit a mass of chemicals either as products or as toxic waste into our environment. Those innocent dollar signals now kill 13 million people a year, a new Holocaust every 6 months. So, in a sense, we are all getting away with murder. This uncomfortable thought is essential to modern society taking effective action to clean up the earth and protect our children in future. If we have given rise to the problem by demanding goods which are produced using toxic substances or with toxic processes, then we alone have the power to correct it. It is already clear that governments do not have the capacity or the will to regulate the global toxic flood. Regulation is important, but if we rely on rules alone to protect our children, the evidence is plain that they will not succeed. In a globalized world, only we, the people, are powerful enough as consumers to send the market signals to industry to cease toxic emissions and to properly reward it for producing clean, safe, healthy products or services. For the first time in human history, we have the means to share a universal understanding of a common threat and what each of us can do to mitigate it. We're all going to be on the internet by 2030, every one of us, all 9 billion of us. Through the internet and social media, concerned citizens and parents are already mobilizing around the world, reaching out to one another across borders, cultural, ethnic, religious, linguistic, and economic divides. Good, concerned people are joining hands at light speed to cleanse our poisoned planet. This is an expression of people power and global democracy like none before. The organizations on this slide have a combined membership of more than 55 million people. Many more are sharing knowledge, advice, and ideas about how to protect our children and clean up society through their own networks. In a technique known as distributed action, organizations like 350.org have created a worldwide protest movement of more than 1 million people. It is a short step from protesting about carbon to protesting about toxic chemistry. And from there to consumers everywhere, exerting their global power for a safer, healthier, cleaner future. I just remember, whenever you spend money, and most of us spend $100 a day or something, every dollar you spend is a vote for the kind of future that your children and grandchildren will have. You're voting every day 100 times on their future. As researchers can attest, there are many exciting new technologies and approaches for cleaning up the planet, like green chemistry, industrial ecology, cradle to cradle, product stewardship, risk assessment, zero waste. But we have to find ways to encourage industry to adopt them. The most effective incentives are consumer-generated market signals. Far from being harmful to industry, a universal demand for clean, safe products will open up fresh markets, create more jobs, build new companies and industries, and generate greater prosperity. There are many ways in which we can all contribute to unpoisoning our world. And here's an outline for a plan. You can find more details in my book, Earth Detox. First of all, we need to form a Clean Up the Earth partnership by joining hands with like-minded organizations all round the planet. We need to demand a new human right, not to be poisoned. I'll talk about that shortly. We need to eliminate the use of coal, oil, and gas and all fossil fuels as soon as possible, really 2030, because they are the source of the poisoning. They are the principal source of the poisoning, and as well as being the damage to the climate. We need to systematically eliminate toxins in the food chain. We need to demand that doctors start advocating preventive health care instead of prescribing more chemicals. We need to train our young scientists, as we train our young doctors, to first do no harm. At the moment, there is no ethical control over science education anywhere in the world. It's a shocking thing to me, but scientists are not taught to do no harm, and they bloody well should be. We need to educate our children to choose non-toxic products, right? To pick the toys that aren't made of plastic. To reward industry by buying green. We need to adopt zero waste, green chemistry, product stewardship, and all of those technologies. And we need to test all chemical products for human safety. Now, in science, it's axiomatic that you cannot solve a problem unless you first understand it. You must understand its scale, its components, and its impacts. In the case of global chemical contamination, at present, the world has close to zero comprehension. Given that human chemical emissions are 5 times larger in scale than our climate emissions and are killing 10 times as many people, it is a terrifying oversight that we have no global body to study and report on them. The world urgently needs a chemical equivalent of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The role of such a body would be to quantify, put an absolute metric on all human chemical emissions, deliberate and unintentional. So even the topsoil that blows away when the farmer plows his paddock needs to be counted because it has a chemical impact. We need to maintain a global register of all chemicals that have been produced, and we need to get rid of the nasty ones. We need to monitor the safety testing of all chemicals released. So most of the chemical safety today is assumed, not the result of testing. It's assumed because no harm showed up, the chemical is therefore safe. It's been grandfathered upon us by industry 30, 40, 50 years ago. We need to assess human health impacts much more thoroughly than we are doing at the moment. And we need to assess the environmental health impacts. Why are the insects disappearing? Why are the honeybees dying? We need answers to these questions. And we need somebody to report to all of humanity, to all governments, on these issues. Finally, everybody in the world today has a right to life, liberty, personal security, marriage and family, equality, work, education, freedom of belief, freedom from torture. These rights are available to all of us under the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. And I find it more than a little disturbing that there is no human right not to be poisoned. In view of the scale of the chemical crisis, its impact on every living person, such a right is now urgent. And bear in mind, this is a right that everybody, all of your grandparents enjoyed. Every human being up until the 20th century enjoyed a world free from chemical poisons or man-made chemical poisons. Now, while it does not in itself fix the problem, a right will spread worldwide awareness much faster. It will set new standards of health and safety for chemicals, and it will encourage individual countries to adopt them. Unless and until we have such a right, there will probably never be again a day in history when we and our children are free from man-made poisons. The chemical avalanche, as I've said, is 5 times larger than climate change. It's here and it's killing 14 million people a year. And yet it's not receiving a fraction of the public, government and media attention that it merits. I hope if you read Earth Detox, you will agree that this is a catastrophic threat to the future of every human alive today or to be born in the remainder of this century. In terms of the threat to our future it poses, it is comparable to global heating, mass extinction, food insecurity, the water crisis, and other mega threats. It demands our understanding, our care, and our resolute action for the sake of all who now live and all who come after us. Thank you.
Well, that was fascinating, Julian. Thank you very much. I'm going to make a couple of comments and ask a couple of questions before I get into the questions that are beginning to line up from the rest of our audience. So the first thing I'd like to say is that I'm really impressed by this addition to human rights. I think it's a fantastic addition, and I hope it goes somewhere. It's also a fabulous suggestion that we have an international body for anthropogenic chemicals. It's about time we had that. It's one of the grossest cases of mismanagement I've seen on the world stage. So that's as far as things that you said. And one thing that you didn't say, and I wouldn't be surprised, is in your book, not only are these chemicals having a direct effect on us, they're also having epigenetic effects on us, and they're probably having epigenetic effects on other organisms, plants, animals, fungi, bacteria, and all that. I find it, this isn't directly in your book or your presentation, but I find it absolutely unbelievable that we currently presume everything is safe until there's actually evidence of harm that emerges and can be shown scientifically and statistically to be directly associated with something. We are not, although we profess often to be, using the precautionary principle. I've seen this directly in some of the work that I used to do with Health Canada and other parts of the federal government in Canada. We are just not doing the job. This leads me to 3 questions. Let me pose the questions. They're short. I can repose each one if necessary. First of all, which, if any, group of chemicals causes you the most concern? Secondly, which has the greatest effect on human fertility, which is something that you mentioned? And as a sub of that, which has the greatest effect on other organisms, especially with respect to their fertility? So those are the 3 things I'm interested in. Go back. The first one is, which, if any, group of chemicals is of most concern to you?
Well, first of all, I would like to make it clear I'm not a chemist. I'm not even a chemist bootlace. I've really got this direct from scientists who are chemists and who are expert on ecotoxicology, etc. I would prefer not to be concerned about any particular group of chemicals, because by doing that, you're starting to prioritize action. The minute you start to prioritize action, you deprioritize action in other areas. So, if you focused only on hormone disruptors, for example, you'd leave an awful lot of very poisonous things lying around in the environment, including heavy metals and such that we know. The ancient Romans knew that heavy metals were dangerous. I don't really want to call out one particular group of chemicals, but if I wanted to nominate a source, I would nominate the mining industry, because the mining industry, in the course of producing 17 billion tons of minerals and energy, displaces somewhere in the vicinity of 150 to 300 billion tons of rock, soil, acid runoff, slags, all the shit that comes out of mining. And that's never been measured by anybody. Nobody has ever actually counted how many tons of overburden get moved worldwide. You can count them in individual copper mines or something like that. You can say, oh, well, to get 7 tons of copper, we got to move 100 tons of dirt. The point is that when you move that dirt, it has a chemical consequence for the environment. There's a famous Rio Tinto in Spain, the Yellow River, that was poisoned 200 years ago in the Napoleonic era. And, and there's a mountain in California that's going to be toxic for 3,000 years to come. That's what happens. So the quantum, the largest quantum of chemical release is from the mining of minerals and the refining of minerals. The second largest is probably from agriculture and development. It's just simply the shifting of topsoil. And topsoil contains good things, but it contains an awful lot of bad things as well. So, you're creating a lot of lung disease, you're creating a lot of asthma, you're creating a lot of all sorts of things. When you start moving topsoil around, you're concentrating toxins in places where they never were before. You're certainly stirring up the dirt. And that's never a good idea. So, if I could nominate those as sources requiring scientific priority for study, 75 billion tons of agricultural released topsoil and 300 billion tons of mining released overburden and topsoil. We ought to be looking there, as well as actually questioning. Nobody should release a chemical unless it actually has a certificate of human safety. And the reason things don't have a certificate of human safety is that scientists are not funded to answer the "is it deadly" question. They are funded to produce a new pesticide. They get funded to find a better way to kill grasshoppers. They don't ask you, will that cause deformities in human babies? And it's only 30 years later, when you've sprayed this stuff all over the landscape, that you find that it causes deformities in human babies. So, we need to have that question asked forcibly at the very beginning of the process of chemical design. At the moment, new chemicals, new poisons are being designed willy-nilly by an industry that is totally off the leash. And, it is driven purely by money. It does, and it only backs off when enough deaths have occurred. Look at what is happening with Roundup. When enough people start getting cancer, people say, whoa, maybe we should have an $11 trillion or billion dollar lawsuit, So, it's hard for me to nominate one. I want the whole bloody lot looked at, because it is one big problem. You can't cut it into pieces.
Interesting. The one that causes me the most concern might be quite a surprise. It's actually mixtures.
Oh, certainly. Only the European community are making any real serious attempts. There are a few groups in America at universities, but only the European community as a government are making any attempts to actually evaluate mixture toxicity. It's very, very hard to do. Look, in the course of a day, you will inhale between 5,000 and 10,000 chemicals, or you will ingest that number, and God knows which ones are mixing and what they're turning into inside your gut or your blood supply or your brain. So it's a very hard thing to do. You can probably identify more toxic mixtures and less toxic mixtures, and that is what is going on. And, you need supercomputers to do this stuff, to work out what the combination. So it's expensive science, but it can be done. But in the first place, we need to know what the raw materials are doing, and we don't even know that. So that's step one, is to have a world body insisting on the evaluation of everything. And instead of just assuming it's all safe because we've been using it since the 18th century, It's not bloody well all safe. We know that. We know coal is not safe. We've known that since the 18th century. We've known that since the 12th century. Actually, first Clean Air Act was passed in England in 1281. These things have been known in the human, in history well, but they've not been tackled properly ever.
So I'm actually going to skip my other questions. I'll come back to them if time permits, because we now have lots of people who are lined up to ask questions. Art Hunter is the first of those, and John Mayer is on deck after him.
Julian, first, thank you for your presentation. It certainly has set most of us thinking about this major issue. Of course, what is important as well is the lifetime of these chemicals, whatever they are. Some are perhaps very short-lived, whereas others go on a long time. And I have heard, of course, about forever chemicals, those which in fact do not degrade with time, and once they're out in the environment, they're there forever. Have you had any opportunity to try and understand what happens with forever chemicals, and perhaps they even commingle and react with other chemicals that are out there to make their own hybrids? Anyway, over to you. What about forever chemicals?
Yeah, sure. I worked for many years with a group of scientists who've been working on PFAS, which started off as firefighting chemicals, basically foam retardants and flame retardants and so forth. So yeah, I mean, they've been aware of the downsides of those things for a long time. Now, of course, Rachel Carson, I mentioned her, she was concerned about DDT because it had long-lasting effects, not because it was particularly toxic. It's not particularly toxic, but because it had very long-lasting effects. Now, a lot of chemists worldwide dedicate their lives to creating tough, indestructible molecules. That's what they do for a living, okay? The tougher they can make it, the greater the value of that chemical. So a pesticide like DDT that goes on forever, or a firefighting foam that is always good. That's why that's why they're so good, because people have worked hard. They are the carbon steel, if you like, of chemistry. And their durability is in the eyes of a chemist their virtue, but if they're poisonous, their durability is a terrible thing, and it will go through generations of human beings poisoning and poisoning and poisoning. And I suppose I should add, almost partly in response to David, if there's one area of chemistry that absolutely terrifies me, it is nanochemistry, because we have got absolutely no idea of the human health impacts of tiny weeny little particles that can get into your brain, get into your child's brain, your embryo's brain, and which will then proceed epigenetically. And Dave mentioned epigenetics, okay? Epigenetics, and I did mention it briefly, actually. I had a cartoon of Homer Simpson and his family, and basically epigenetics is if you poison yourself, the consequences of that poisoning can be transferred to your children, your grandchildren, your great-grandchildren, and your great-great-grandchildren. So they can still be suffering the disease that you suffered from as the one who's directly exposed to the chemical. Now, that's not hard science yet. That's rats in laboratories science. Okay, they proved it'll go through 4 generations of rats. Will it go through 4 generations of humans? Don't know, haven't tried it, would be unethical to try it. So that's going to be a question that's going to be very hard to answer. But there is no doubt that if you do genetic damage to somebody, that genetic damage can get into their sperm or ova and be transferred to their children. And what is horrifying is that there is now good scientific evidence that genetic damage is then transferred to their children and their children and their children. So these things, this is like a pharaonic curse, it goes down the generations.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great. So John Mayer and then Anitra Thorag, I think you had 2 things. You can bring them both up at the same time.
Julian, I don't expect you to be an expert on the worst sites all over the world, but we do have a rock star here in Canada. It's called the oil sands tailing ponds. And I just wonder if you could give us, have you read anything about it? Any studies that you can tell us how dangerous it is compared to other world-class dumps? And can it be actually cleaned up?
I can't answer that in detail because I'm not familiar with the various chemicals that are present there. The problem we have is the problem of tobacco smoke. Tobacco smoke contains 7,000 chemicals. Which are the ones that cause cancer? Don't know. We don't know to this day. We know tobacco smoke causes cancer, but we don't know which bits of it. And when you release a mass of petroleum or tar sands or whatever it is, you know, highly processed carbon like that, there are bound to be thousands, millions, maybe billions of chemicals and chemical mixtures in it. Best thing you can do is leave it alone and ignore it. I mean, there are toxic places naturally in the world, you know, the throats of volcanoes and what have you, and you know, tar pits and so on, which one should stay away from for one's health. What we've done is created one of those. If you can think of it like a volcanic eruption, that's what we've created in a way, and a whole lot of emissions concentrated in one area. And there will be millions of poisons in that admixture. But I can't tell you which ones. You need to get a chemist, an ecotoxicologist to go over it with a fine-tooth comb. And what effect will those have? So some of them will kill people. Some of them will cause cancer in 40 years' time. Some of them will make all the honeybees in the area go infertile, you know. So there will be consequences that you really cannot predict down the line from something like that. But it is a gross act of pollution. I mean, it is a true disgrace. You know, nobody should have been allowed to do that without having an absolute obligation on them to clean it up. In other words, they should have had to park, you know, 10, 15, 20% of their profits for cleanup. Not that I think you can ever do a really good cleanup of something like that. That is something that only geology will fix. So we're talking millions of years. It's like a nuclear meltdown, really.
Well, they have I think $2 million in deposits to clean up, $2 billion to clean up the oil sands, and the cost will be between 60 and 250 if they can actually do it. So anyway, thanks. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Okay, over to Anitra Thorog, followed by Jeff Holland.
Thank you very much for a really wonderful wake up to an overview of how we're decimating the planet. I work a lot with plants rather than people. And FAO has said that 85% of our forests have degraded, many of them in this same time frame you talk about the diseases. And we know in the oceans, where I work most of the time, 50% of the near shore have degraded. I'm concerned about the overflow of so many of these chemical factories and manufacturing places, and the excess when it just gets thrown out, and particularly what intense storms do to that, carrying it to the shallow waters, the lakes and the estuaries, where it gets buried and then emerges as shellfish, fish, and all kinds of other edible things, including the plastics that we take in. And I'm wondering if your vision of this whole poisoning of the planet has taken into consideration the botanical element, and if so, how you see solutions to that also.
Well, absolutely, it has. I'm an agricultural journalist, and I'm familiar with the way farmers spray everything in sight. You know, so, you know, no plants, no people. That's the bottom line. You know, if we kill the plants on this planet, we've finished ourselves, because plants are at the base of the food chain. going all the way down to algae, but plants of various shapes and sizes are the basis for all food and the food cycle on Earth if we destroy that. Now, I mentioned, I think in my third or fourth slide, the 760 sites of dead oceans worldwide. Now, we're seeing more and more of these things. They're off almost every heavily populated coastline on Earth. So in the South China Sea, they're off the coast of France and Britain. I mean, look at Britain, it's pouring its sewage into its rivers, and its rivers are flowing into the North Sea. And, we are destroying oceans now. And nutrients, we think of nutrients as being very good for you, well, they are, but if you leave them in concentration in the environment, they kill things, or they create algal blooms, and the algal blooms lead to bacterial blooms, and the bacterial blooms strip the oxygen out of the water column, and everything that breathes oxygen dies. So all the fish die, the starfish die, the crabs die, the lot. So that's the kind of thing. Now, I don't know whether people are familiar with the term a Canfield Ocean. If not, please read a book called Under a Green Sky by a Welsh geologist. But basically, it describes the situation that probably led to the Permian extinction, when there was an enormous runoff of nutrients into the world's oceans, and you got the biggest extinction event in Earth history occurring as a result of that. Because what happened was that the planet warmed, there was a lot of carbon dioxide released, the ocean currents broke down, the mixing between the oxygenated top level of the water and the lower levels of water, that broke down. So the entire ocean became stagnant, and everything bigger than a compost microbe in the ocean died. Something like 96% of oceanic species disappeared during the Permian extinction, and 76% of land species disappeared. That's quite interesting. So, a Canfield Ocean is actually what we're creating, because what we're doing is we're mobilizing all of the nutrients from agriculture across the whole world, and we're pouring nitrogen into the system way in excess of the global nitrogen cycle, 3 or 4 times what the Earth naturally cycles in terms, through plants and so forth. And what we're doing is we're digging up all this fossil carbon, which is the detritus left over from dead life. We're digging up all this dead algae, remobilizing it and blowing it out the back of our Hummers. And from there, it drops back into the ocean. So you look at the Baltic Sea. The Baltic Sea is overnourished by the nitrous oxide coming out of the back of motor vehicles. So it's a nutrient wasteland, a eutrophic sea, largely because of industrial and transport emissions. It's not that people are adding fertilizer to the Baltic. Well, they are adding it, and Leningrad and places are shitting in the Baltic, but the bulk of the nutrients going into the Baltic are coming out of the air from Europe's burning of fossil fuels. So yes, we're having a terrible effect. And once the ocean currents start to break down, and they are starting to break down again, we're going to see this stratification in the ocean. And stratification leads to algal blooms. And when algae die, you get bacterial blooms. And bacterial blooms basically are the end of advanced life. Mm-hmm. That's just, we turn the Earth back into a stagnant, Precambrian type of world. Basically, the reason we're having this conversation today is oxygen. For 2 billion years, the Earth consisted of nothing other than microbes, because nothing could survive because there was no oxygen in the oceans.
That's right.
It is only when oxygen started to be generated, enough oxygen started to be generated by blue-green algae, it was their excrement, that you started to get green algae, you started to get life, plants, animals, etc., etc. So everything that's happened in the last 700 million years has been a product of the oxygen poisoning that occurred around about 700 million years ago, 2 billion years ago. So it's interesting. These are cycles, but what I wonder is whether the humans have in fact kicked off another cycle of global poisoning and stagnation. It's this is just unfathomable scientifically at the moment, but it is something we need to watch.
Thank you.
Okay,
I'm going to
Anitra, you had a second question?
Seed my moment asking about us poisoning ourselves and our doctors poisoning ourselves with all kinds of pharmaceuticals, and we with our black market drugs. I'll cede those moments to someone else because this was such a good answer he gave
Okay.
for the surface waters. Thank you.
Okay, great. We'll go to Jeff Holland, followed by John Mayer. Again, you got a different question.
Well, I'd like to ask Julian about the role of gender dominance in getting us to the place we're at. It seems to me that the future requires that women become a part of the process of determining where we go. And I'd like Julian to address that.
Yeah, with pleasure, Jeffrey. Look, one of the things that really came at me strongly when I was doing the research for this book is that and we talk about chemistry and the kinds of chemicals that are designed, they are not the products of women. They are the products of men. Chemistry is a male-dominated sport, right? The chemical companies of the world, 80–90% of their board members, their chairmen, their CEOs are blokes, men. So chemistry is the result of male groupthink. Women have very little say, and it stood out to me that men head up all the big chemical combines, but women head up all of the organizations that are concerned about poisoning and children and development and nurturing and safe upbringing. Women are on the side of safety, men are on the side of risk-taking. Now, if you roll this back to our Stone Age ancestry, that's what men were designed to do. They were designed to go out and take a risk and tackle the bloody woolly mammoth with a stone spear. And, if we got trampled, that was just too bad. That was what men were supposed to do. And we got trampled by the machine guns in World War I, and we got trampled by the bombs in World War II. Men, men are short-term thinkers, and they are very technical in their approaches. They like to solve their problems quickly with chemicals, weapons, tools. We like the problem. We want to kill that insect now. We don't care whether the insect spray kills the baby, or we don't even think about that. It doesn't actually occur to most chemists that the insect spray might kill the baby. The purpose is to kill the insect. So that is male thought. Fix the problem now. Save life now if you can. Female thought tends to say, what about the grandkids? And this is why this led me to the conclusion that basically women should be in charge of the world from here on in. The only fit leaders for humanity in the 21st century are female, because they do take these things into account. And men in the 21st century have got to start thinking like women, not like men. We are not cavemen any longer. We've got to start thinking about the long range, the future. We've got to start caring about those things. Money is not all that matters. Money is a figment of the human imagination. But the food industry, the chemical industry, the oil industry, these are all about money, this imaginary stuff that we crave so much. And unfortunately, that's male groupthink. Now, we need to get female thinking paramount if we are to save humanity. And humanity is not just threatened by chemistry or by climate or even by nuclear weapons. It's threatened by 10 mega threats. And we need, someone with a longer range than men have. Now, evidence that women are already doing this, they've cut their fertility. The driver of all these problems is human overpopulation. Who has cut the birth rate? Women. Worldwide, women have cut the birth rate from 4.5 babies a woman down to 2.4, right? And just in the last 50 years or so. So women are already, believe it or not, conscious of the problems of overpopulation. Men are the ones, they're the priests, the journalists, the politicians who are advocating and bribing people to have more babies. The real estate developers, it's not women who are wanting this to happen, or not women in the majority. So put women in charge, you will get population under control. You will get a lot of other things like chemistry under control. Put women on the boards of chemical companies worldwide. Put women in charge of chemical regulation. Put women in charge of climate regulation. Do the same thing, and you'll get a whole different outcome. So I'm not arguing for gender equality or anything here. I'm just talking about which group of humans is best qualified to lead us through the most dangerous period in our entire history.
I hope that's a good answer, Jeff. There's a fascinating link to a Twitter string that I discovered last week that's up on our website that talks about the differences between men and women and the implications of that for the potential survival of humanity, if anybody wants to look for that.
If I could just interject there, Dave, the biggest difference between men and women is that women don't start wars.
Yeah. Okay, we're going to go to John Mayer, followed by Ben Oliphant.
Yeah, Julian, I think that your response to the last question is worthy of being clipped out and used as, in very many different places. So tremendous answer. In the COVID pandemic, we spent huge amounts of money developing vaccines. A couple of the people I followed were really promoting vitamin D, but there was no research being done on it because you can't possibly make money on it. You couldn't, proving that vitamin D worked might cost you $20 or $40 million for a study, but everybody on the planet sells the stuff for a quarter of a cent a pill or something ridiculous. And so no one, one of the most beneficial things we could have done for ourselves was load up on vitamin D, I think. So that if private industry wouldn't do that, and the public funded research apparently didn't do it, my question is, I would expect to have public research produce better grounded research, more useful research long term, and what percentage now of research is being funded privately and what percentage is public, and is that ratio changing?
I'm not sure of the answer to that worldwide, but I would say this, that unfortunately, private research, private funding of research, when you put it into a university or something like that, it captures the public component. In other words, if a company gives $100,000 to a university to do a bit of research, the university matches it with $100,000 worth of university money. Very often, I know this because I was a director of Australia's National Science Agency, and I could see how much of our research was being captured and appropriated by industry, even though the money that funded it was mostly public. In some cases, up to $4 out of 5 came from the taxpayer. So unfortunately, private entrains entrains public money in the research field, and the focus is on products from research that make a lot of money in the short term. And we've got to think about this thing called money. You might have noticed that your house is worth 4 times today what it was worth 30 or 40 years ago. That's not because the value of the house has changed. That's because there's 4 times as much money sloshing around the world economy. We've been printing this imaginary stuff out of thin air, creating this enormous bubble. And it's going to blow up in our faces. It's bound to blow up in our faces, like all bubbles, like the South Sea bubble, the tulip boom, the wool boom, you name it.
Every 10 or 15 years. So control. So you're saying that private industry with a smaller percentage can actually a contribution can actually control the public research, which is very disturbing.
It is, and suppose things that worry me. I mean, doctors, for example, as a profession, have been captured by the pharmaceutical industry. I see doctors as these days little better than petrol pump attendants, and pumping petrochemical pharmaceuticals into us for every little ailment that we've got, instead of prevention. Look at cancer research, for example. I mean, how many billions of dollars are expended on trying to cure cancer instead of trying to stop cancer? An awful lot of cancer, 40% of the cancers we know about, can be prevented. You know, slip,
Okay.
stop, and slap is the formula we use in Australia to prevent skin cancer. Teach kids to put hats on and sunglasses and what have you. So you can prevent an awful lot of human disease. And from a government point of view, it makes perfect sense to reduce the burden on your hospitals by preventing disease. But the petrochemical industry and the pharmaceutical industry, the one and the same really, I've got so much pressure on governments to go with the, let's give them a $10,000 cure that doesn't actually save their lives. It just extends their life for a few more years, paying us $10,000 a year, you know, with a super new cancer drug or something like that. It's the most cynical thing. And look, I've heard many people in the pharmaceutical industry admit to this, that you know, it's not the malaria drug, the malaria vaccine that they want, because that would save too many lives. They want something that will extend life a little bit longer, you know, another 5 years, you know. So it's a very, very cynical, greedy, nasty bloody exercise that's going on here. And we're all its victims. And our doctors coming out of bloody university with almost zero toxicology these days. They don't teach them toxicology like they did in the old days. And they're piling all these new toxins. And I would think that everybody in this audience has had an experience of an adverse drug reaction at one time or another. 12% of all people who go into hospital die as a result of medical attention, mostly adverse drug reactions. So it's a, you know, it's a pretty sick system, and it, you know, preventive medicine would probably reduce the health burden by a half.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, thanks very much.
All right, we're going to go to Lynn Oliphant, followed by Ted Manning.
Well, thanks, Julian, for making us aware of the size of this problem. I mean, the number of different species of man-made chemicals and toxic chemicals and the amounts that we use are staggering. My question is that given the number of chemicals, is it realistic to think that we could actually test them before we put them out in the environment? If we had every biologist, every chemist, every geologist that was trained beyond university level and gave them 99% of our research budget, it seems like a task that perhaps can't be done. And maybe your idea of just putting the women in charge is the only answer. I'm not sure. Your comments.
Yeah, look, I realize it's a big ask, but I also think it's an ethical ask. How much longer can we go on killing a quarter of the human population with poisoning? I mean, what's the ethical justification for that? I see none myself. I mean, this is worse. This is worse than, as I say, World War II, 7 million people a year died. This is 14 million people, right? So you know, this is worse than Stalin, Hitler, the whole bloody lot, you know, in terms of its impact on humans. And we've got to do something about it. Now, I think there is excessive generation of novel chemicals, and that's where the nanotechnology thing comes in as well. The chemistry industry is on a high at the moment, churning out novel molecules left, right, and center. They've got thousands of PhD students working on, you know, producing new novel substances that are being, you know, they'll poison a few cockroaches and a few guinea pigs and a few monkeys, but they won't test it properly. And they're not required to test it properly. Under most systems, they just stick it out on the market and say, oh, use this on your lawn, use this on your baby. and basically there is no requirement to show these things are safe. And I think having the human right and insisting that chemicals are tested would at least, get rid of some of the nastier ones that are coming down the track.
But my question on that is given the fact that in today's world, we're getting tremendous pressure to not use animals for testing, for example, exactly how would we test for the safety? Given the fact that it's not only the human health aspect, but as you pointed out, if it affects plants, that's just as bad. If it affects the pollinators, it's just as bad. The amount of testing is voluminous.
Yeah, absolutely. So you start with things like honeybees and ants and what have you, and if it's bad for them, then you go up the hierarchy. But look, there's a lot of good science these days for testing things about their effect on human beings, just simply in a petri dish. I mean, they're developing some very good cellular techniques that can measure toxicity of individual chemicals and of mixtures. But better than that, we have now got supercomputers that produce predictive systems that can tell you the likelihood of the toxicity. So that's the work that really needs to be accelerated. You could start by screening all your novel chemicals in a supercomputer that predicts what the combinations of chemicals do and what happens to a particular chemical when various atoms peel off it and the molecule changes from a mildly poisonous thing to a totally poisonous thing. So, that can actually already be done. And it's not as expensive, and it certainly doesn't involve, doing the sort of things that were done in the Chinese concentration camps during World War II. The Japanese concentration camps or the German concentration camps. So you don't have to test it on people. But we are, my point is, every single member of this audience and every single person on Earth is a guinea pig in a bloody great worldwide chemistry experiment. You are being exposed to poisons, whether you like it or not.
Okay, thank you.
That's a scary thought. Okay, Ted Manning, I believe you had both a comment and a question.
Comment, and I'll give them both right now. Julian, I think we should move down the food chain for our testing of toxics and just use politicians. But that's another comment. There have been some success stories when we got everybody to work together. And I think the Great Lakes I put on as being something that actually sort of works because it's almost drinkable now, even though it caught on fire and we had the Love Canal and so on. But boy, that took a lot of work. And it took 2 countries and 8 provinces and states working together for ages and actual prosecutions and so on like that. So I think there are success stories that are possible. That's just my comment. My other concern is I think you really need to strongly support the idea of not being poisoned as a human right and putting it in front of the World Court, in front of the UN, in front of the people who can understand that that's just as bad as using mustard gas or just as bad as bombing people from the sky in Ukraine or whatever. So I'm not sure. I'm just saying, okay, so let's do that. So my real question is, how the hell are we going to make that happen?
Well, in the same way that climate change, there's something like 1,600 climate cases with various groups of kids suing their governments and suing oil companies and things like that. I think a lot of it will happen by citizen action. And a lot of that action will be led by women. Take it from me, mothers are bloody mad about this. Educated who've got a bit of science know that it's damn dangerous and they're really going for it. Now, what was your first point? Because I really wanted to comment on that. Your first point was...
My first point was we do have some success stories where we get all jurisdictions to work together for things they can see and they fear.
That is wonderful, and it's totally true. I mean, in Australia, we had the Sydney Olympics in 2000. We took the most polluted site in the whole of Australia and we renovated it or cleansed it, cleaned it up basically, and built the Olympic Stadium and everything on top of it. So it's possible. And guess what? The real estate value of that was zero, and it went to $600 million over a space of 18 months. So actually, if you clean places up, you get a massive economic benefit as amongst other things. But the problem we've got is if you take a deep breath now, you're inhaling Chinese pollution, Indian pollution. There is a river of pollution flowing around the planet, and you can't regulate that. You can't get them to clean up their industries any faster. I mean, I think China is actually making the effort because they've got a lot of angry women on their hands as well.
Yeah, no, I've worked there with them on just that. And yes, they're trying, and they're just as useless as we are.
Yeah, they've got a corrupted system where a lot of officialdom is in the pockets of industry and so forth. India is even less organized than China.
That's true.
Organized. The Middle East, I mean, a lot of this stuff starts in places like Dubai and Qatar, the oil company, Saudi Arabia, probably the polluter on earth. But it's all going up into the air, and it's going into the oceans, it's going into the global food chain, and nobody can escape it. That's my point. The earth is a polluted site now. And with the best will in the world, we can't apply the same principles that we apply in Canada and Australia to the entire earth. There is no regulator for the entire earth.
Thanks, Julian. That was a very good talk. Thank you.
Okay. I'm looking for John Schmidt. Oh, good. He is there. And it's over to you, followed by Gord Kubinek.
Morning, Julian. I don't know if these are questions or points. I guess it results in a question. You mentioned risk-taking by males, and as someone who's worked in the risk area, I've found that risk takers tend to ignore the uncertainty in the equation and just proceed as if they know what the consequences are and their likelihoods, and then of course they're surprised by the results. The question is, what is the likelihood that we, and you speak about not being able to focus on one or two things, but in fact, treating this as a global combined problem that we have to address altogether, not just piecemeal. But global humanity tends to be willfully ignorant of this. And if they can't see it, if it's not hitting them in the face, my statistics professor called it interocular trauma, hitting them between the eyes, they can ignore it. So what is the likelihood, potential of global humanity to actually address this problem, not these problems, this problem as a whole? I have to say that I'm not optimistic.
Right. Yeah, well, John, as you know, I'm the author of 2 books on the human existential crisis, which is 10 megathreats, not just 1 or 2, but all of these things are interconnected. They're all driven by overpopulation, overconsumption, and overpollution. And that gives you the clue where we can put the brakes on. And there are practical solutions. My last book, which I spoke to Kakor about 2 or 3 months ago, describes a couple of hundred things that people can do in their own lives to actually reduce these, and to But the point I must make is that no government on earth has got a plan for human survival. Not one of them, right? They're not interested. They're still playing this 19th century one-upmanship game. We're back in the Bismarckian era, where one nation has got to big note itself and put down the other nation and threaten each other and, rattle the sabers and do all this childish stuff, as if there was no problem. And yet we're looking at the potential extinction of our civilization, certainly, and the potential extinction of our species. So that problem is slightly larger than the problem in Ukraine, than the problem of America versus China. than whatever we regard as whatever's in the news headlines at the moment. Now, I think that by making people aware of all the different threats that face them, you are going to build total awareness of the combined threat. So the problem with climate is that a lot of people look out the window and say, the weather looks okay to me, climate doesn't really concern me. But if they think, oh, I've got an infant daughter and I'm poisoning her by using too much pesticide about the household, that person might take action to clean up their own life. So very often people will act from personal motives rather than necessarily altruistic motives. And I'm hoping that some of these different threats will trigger different groups of people to respond to them. As I say, most of the women that I know of are very concerned about this chemical thing. You meet a few women who work in the chemical industry and just think it's great because they run with the blokes. But most women don't. Most women think it's bloody awful, and something needs to be done about it. And I feel that the power of femaledom is rising in the world today. And it's making itself felt even in the more backward places of the world. No names, no pack drill. But, it is making itself felt, these concerns. So I actually think that awareness of the global poisoning episode is likely to reinforce climate action. Because it's the same criminals responsible for both. If people want to clean up the world, they actually have to get rid of fossil fuels. So, that might be a better argument than just get rid of fossil fuels to save, to fix the weather. So really, I think that the one that affects everybody, and I've spoken to Kakor about this in the past, is food security. I mean, every single one of us has got to eat every single day. And if our food security goes out the window for all of these various reasons, then, we have a mega style crisis on our hands. But food security is something that everybody on Earth can understand. And when the food supply becomes less secure, and it is becoming less secure, more and more people are going to wake up to that before they wake up to any of these other big picture issues. So I think food security is going to be what makes climate awareness much bigger, and chemical awareness. The awareness of what's in. You walk down the lollies, the sweets aisle at the supermarket, there's all that. You're feeding your children on coal and oil. All those brightly coloured lollies are dyed with coal and oil. So you've got mums unaware feeding their children on fossil fuels. It's disgusting, but make them aware of that, and there'll be a big change. So I actually think that the awareness of each of these issues is going to impinge on a different audience among the 8 billion humans.
Thanks, Julian. Just one aspect of that, and this isn't a question or anything else, except that we do, as I said, try to remain ignorant, and food labeling in North America and here requires that most of the contents of what's in the food are put on the label. How many people read them is another issue, but the contents of the packaging is a little less obvious. And so when you talk about the chemicals in the packaging, even, I mean, I'm not, pollution and all that other stuff, but the things that we're purchasing off the shelves in the store, we just don't know what we're getting.
Well, your organic zucchini comes complete with volatile organic hydrocarbons because it's wrapped in bloody, shrink wrap or something. It's disgraceful. There are a number of bodies, including a very good one in Switzerland, that actually study food contamination by packaging. And quite a few people, you notice, are getting aware of this now. And so they're getting rid of the BPA plastics. The drink bottles are changing. The chemistry of the drink bottles is changing. People are going back to paper cups in coffee shops and things like that. So little by little, consumer awareness is actually gnawing away at, corporate laziness, and it's making the change happen. I agree it's far too little, far too late, but it is happening, and it is demonstration of people power. If you demand a paper cup from your coffee shop, and enough of you do that, people will start paying attention. The coffee people.
Hey, Art, can you hear me? I can't turn on my video and I can't raise my hand. I'm
Charlie, I can hear you. You weren't in the line as far as I could see, but let's go to Charlie Hall for a quick comment.
well, as far as I know, this was laid out in 1972 in the limits to growth, and a number of papers, including my own, have shown that the limits to growth model is still pretty much right on course, as much as anything. And but meanwhile, I mean, I'm totally sympathetic with what you're saying, but my perspective, of course, is it's not only the fossil fuel that's chemically in the food, it's the embodied fossil fuel, which is about 10 calories per calorie. And why isn't that written on the outside of a package of candy or something like that, so people can get some sense of what this is? And my guess is that the limits of fossil fuel will be reflected in the limits of food that you talked rightly about. But in the meanwhile, there isn't a single politician that I know anywhere in the world that runs on any platform except growth. And I feel totally defeated by the political platforms.
Yeah, I share your concern, and I'm a little bit worried about democracy now, I have to say, for two reasons. First of all, if you add them all together, oil, coal, gas, tar sands, all of that sort of stuff, and petrochemicals and pharmaceuticals, you're talking about an industry worth $7 to $10 trillion. That is a country, that's the third largest economy on earth, or the second largest. It's slightly behind the US and China in scale. And it has nothing to worry about except selling its product and extracting its product. It doesn't worry about schools or healthcare or all of the other things that governments worry about. So it spends hundreds of billions of dollars bribing politicians. So I mean, anyone who thinks, if they live in Canada or Australia or Britain or America, that they are living in a democracy has got rocks in their head. They're living in a country where most politicians are on the payroll, if not now, then when they leave politics, they're on the payroll of the fossil fuels empire. And, these people are being paid now, or as I say, when they leave politics, to actually frustrate and foul up the climate movement, the anti-chemical movement, the environmental movement, all of those things. Politicians are paid to delay this. And this is why, really, I conclude that the nation state is a failed experiment. It came into being after Napoleon, all right? The nation state didn't exist. It was all medieval stuff before that, feudal stuff. It came into existence mainly with Germany, the rise of nationalism in Germany, during the Napoleonic era, and it was consolidated by Bismarck, and so on. Now, that's run its course. I think the nation state has pretty much had it. Why do I think that? Because most of the money these days is controlled by corporates. Most of the big corporates are bigger than most countries. We've got groups like fossil fuels that call the shots by controlling politicians and governments in the so-called democracies and in the so-called autocracies. Like Russia is totally controlled by fossil fuels. Saudi Arabia is totally controlled by fossil fuels. The Emirates is totally controlled by fossil fuels. So fossil fuels rules a lot of. It is the government behind the government, but they don't want to be bothered with, as I say, schools and hospitals and roads. They just want profits. So the dilemma we face in politics is today that our entire political system has been suborned. And this has really happened just in the last 20 years or so. And the thing that's done it is actually climate awareness, because climate awareness has driven the fossil fuels industry together. Previously, they were just a bunch of competing corporations. Now they are a consolidated conspiracy. And look, don't take this from me. Read the BBC, and there's a whole lot of documentation on this thing. Merchants of Doubt, all of that stuff. The other thing I want to point out to you is that with chemical poisoning of the human brain and the decline in IQ, human beings are becoming much less able to discern between good government and bad government. We are time and again electing governments that are bad for us. We are a dumber race than our parents and grandparents, significantly dumber. So I mean, when you see things like, the Trumpist movement in the United States, you see things like Brexit, you realize that the fucking idiots are in charge. Idiocracy has replaced democracy. And it's getting very hard to think of a democratic formula that actually overcomes a majority of stupidity or lack of education. If you're damaging the human brain at the age of 2, 3, 4, these people grow up to be voters with damaged brains. They can't tell the difference between a good politician and a bad politician. They can't even discern their own self-interest. So we're in a lot of trouble with this. I'm sort of going back to Plato and thinking, I wish we had a philosopher king, because that's the only way we're going to get out of this hole. But I know philosopher kings are in short supply. So what do we do? But we are damaging our brains, and we are becoming a more stupid animal.
I have taken to calling it government of the people by the corporations for the corporations. So I'm going to go to Gord Kubinek. Derek Paul is going to get a moment to give a comment afterwards, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Hi there. I've really enjoyed your conversation. I am a chemical engineer, and I have worked in the chemistry industry. And my father, who was a chemical engineer, said he hadn't met a chemical once that he trusted. So my father would cheer you on. My question is specifically about gender confusion, or what's called gender dysphoria, where we have a lot of issues going on. And I'll give you a concrete example. I'm still teaching part-time. I have a student who is changing gender from male to female right in front of my eyes. It's quite something to behold. I have a nephew who's 8 years old, who just is having a 10-year-old friend changing gender also from male to female, and he's extremely upset. So there's basically not of the implications for the individual, but there are ripple effects for people all around there. So I'm just wondering your comment upon this very touchy and unfortunately it's become a very political issue, and how we can talk about it and deal with it in a constructive fashion, which is realistic but compassionate.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to say is that human DNA is incredibly fragile stuff, and it gets damaged fairly easily. And the reason we've all got white beards and grey hair and wrinkly skins, is that our DNA has been progressively damaged by the chemical environment we've encountered. Not the man-made chemical environment, just the totality of the chemical environment we've encountered during our life. The aging process is the process of repeating mistakes in your DNA. So that gives you an idea of how, and we eventually die of it. That's why we have a finite lifespan. So that's why, but you can exacerbate that with these hormonal disrupting chemicals. Now, the hard data is that human sperm counts are down by 66% in every country where we look. Female fertility rates are down by 10 or 20%. So people are having a much greater difficulty conceiving and having children. Developmental problems are skyrocketing, and any developmental doctor will tell you that. Where we get to gender, what determines your gender, what gender you think you are, what gender you prefer to sleep with, that sort of thing, it becomes much muddier. But I've read a number of scientific papers that say a person's sense of their gender is definitely, chemically influenced. Now, the evidence seems to me pretty dodgy at the moment, but it's a good hypothesis, and it needs, like all hypotheses, to be tested. The one that I think is interesting, and with the rise of the rainbow movement worldwide, is that human preferences for the same sex appear to be rising. And I wonder whether that is chemically induced as well. People without being aware of it have been bathed in endocrine disruptors. And so blokes prefer blokes, girls prefer girls. Especially as I think an interesting thing is happening, with contraception and so on, the emphasis on sex for reproduction, as opposed to sex for leisure or recreation or sport or whatever you do it for, or fun. The emphasis is changing. The purpose of sex has changed fairly dramatically. In World War I, when boys were going off to war, they had to have a girl before they went, to leave their descendants behind them. Then sex was about reproduction, but nowadays sex isn't about reproduction. As I say, it's about recreation more than anything else. So that's actually changing the purpose of sex. Now, whether there is actually physiological change, we know that there's physiological change because of the amount of developmental problems and the reproductive problems. Now, whether that then translates into sexual preference and your view of your gender is much harder to prove, very hard to prove, really. But the evidence is massing, and I'm seeing more and more scientific papers saying that it is.
In particular, how do we respond to it? Like, how do we talk about it with somebody in a rational but sympathetic fashion? Because that's where it gets very difficult, because we have these two camps being developed in every issue, but also with this issue, which is very divisive. It's contributing to a lot of social division and conflict from people I know personally. Well,
look, I mean, it's been a very sensitive topic because, pardon me for saying this, certain religions have used sex as a means to control the people for a very long time. They supervised the marriage ceremonies, they've decried adultery, and this has been going on. And look, let's just go back to the 10 Commandments for 10 seconds. When Moses was trying to get 30 argumentative Jews through the Sinai desert, he made a set of rules, one of which was don't sleep with your neighbor's wife. So, which was a very good rule for the Sinai desert. But in modern New York City, it's not telling people not to commit adultery is a bit of a futile activity. So horses for courses, that's what I'm saying. So, but the rules, the old religious rules that come out of, basically Neolithic times, are still being applied in certain societies. They may have worked, and they may have been quite useful in Neolithic times. They're not terribly relevant in the 21st century, but there's a lot of people still promoting them. And that makes it a very difficult conversation, while ever people are continuing to raise these things. I mean, animals don't worry about gender all that much. I mean, I've seen cattle in a paddock cheerfully shafting one another, male or female. It's not a thing that seems to bother them conscience-wise. Humans have had this conscience thing superimposed on our natural behavior. I mean, chimpanzees don't have these kind of concerns. So it's I don't know how you solve the problem, because some people like persecuting other people for their sexual practices, and will continue to do so. I think we just have to stick up for every individual's right to be the person that you are, that you think you are, and, to make love to whom you like.
Julian, I'm an editor of a journal, and if you're interested, we have a section for commentary. I thought the idea that the chemicals might be changing our orientation or what have you, although I think a lot of it was suppressed for an awful long time. But I don't know. And so if you would like to write me about possibly writing some kind of editorial about that from the perspective of a chemist, my email is chall, CHALL @esf.edu. My name is Charlie Hall.
I can get you guys.
Dave to send it to me. Yeah.
I can
Yeah.
get you guys hooked up.
If you
No
want.
worries.
It was just, that was a really innovative idea. And I think Paul Derek is on.
But let me repeat, the evidence, the scientific evidence, the hard scientific evidence that chemicals are changing people's gender orientation is fairly slight at the moment. But I've seen it being discussed in quite a number of scientific papers. So people are opening their minds to the idea. I mean, it's pretty clear, for example, that chemistry, endocrine chemistry, is behind the boom in obesity worldwide and is also behind the boom in diabetes. So why shouldn't it apply to sexuality as well? But as I say, it's not something you can prove. It's as difficult as the tobacco lung cancer rate.
Well, that's why it would be an editorial or a commentary.
Okay.
Short.
Okay, so over to Derek.
Hello. Thank you very much, Julian Cribb, for having made the comment to put the women in charge. And it just happens that about 3 weeks ago, I looked up for the second or third time Maria Gimbuta's work on ancient Europe. And there's a book, she wrote a book called The Goddesses and Gods of Old Europe with a lot of extra words. And I just want to read you this because it's, I think, very inspiring and significant. In old Europe, the world of myth was not polarized into male and female as it was among the Indo-European and many other nomadic peoples of the steppes. Both principles, male and female, were manifest side by side. That's in old Europe. Neither is subordinate to the other, and by complementing one or one another, their power is doubled. And I think putting women in charge is too simplistic. Because it will have there will be a backlash to that. What you have to do is to try and achieve the complementing of the male principle and the female, which, as she said, doubled their power in old Europe. And it's a marvelous book, and she was a fantastic researcher.
Yeah, I'm a classicist by training, and I'm aware of how the ancient Greeks and people like that saw all these kinds of things. And the old chthonic gods of Greece, a lot of them are female, and the Earth Mother is a real factor. So yes, that might have been the case back in early agrarian societies.
Yeah.
When I say put women in charge, I think we need to move women to a position of power. They're not in a position of power at the moment. They may be a majority of the human race, but they do not have a majority control over practically anything. And I think that has to change, because I just ask myself, if you took a chemical company or an oil company, and you put a majority of women on the board, and a majority of women, only 51%, as is the human population, in senior executive positions, what kind of products would that company produce? And would they be any different from what it produces today?
Mm-hmm.
And as I say, I think many of these things are a product of male groupthink, of a whole lot of blokes getting together and saying, oh, that's a good idea. Let's kill the insects quicker. Let's build a better bomb. It's a whole lot of, macho bloody idiots, so reinforcing each other's prejudices. And I want those prejudices, the prejudice in favor of war, the prejudice in favor of widespread destruction, widespread pollution. I want those prejudices diluted. And women can do that, and they're wanting to do that too. So that's where I'd like it. So I'll settle for 51%. Yeah, I don't, not necessarily 100% women rule. That would be pretty frightening, but 51% would do me. Just stop bullying women in large, powerful organizations, political parties, and things like that into being like small men.
I think you have to educate a whole generation of new men to understand that.
I think that the nuclear wars that are coming down will educate quite a lot of people.
And those wars may well wipe out a lot of the people who currently are probably just beyond the pale and can't be saved. I note that in the last couple of minutes, there's direct relation to the earlier questions that I wanted to ask about the effects on human fertility and also on the fertility of other organisms. But I think we're going to shelve that, and perhaps we're going to get you back again for some other conversations. One interesting point, if you could make a very quick comment on this, you said that you think every time I pull $1 out of my wallet to buy something, I'm giving a vote saying that's a good thing. The problem I see is I have no idea, as somebody else mentioned, what the fossil fuel content was that went into making that thing. I also have no idea, and I know somebody made a comment that we have food labeling. Well, I can tell you, because I was involved with this for a while, we do not have food labeling for contaminants. Anything that's less than about 1%, you don't have to put it on the label. If it's there in parts per million, you don't put it on the label. So how are we supposed to know as consumers what's in the stuff we're buying?
Okay. Well, I don't know how many of you are aware of the work of the Environmental Working Group in the US, EWG. I mean, but basically, if you want to know, suppose you're in a fresh fruit market and you want to know which fruits are the most poisonous, don't buy the strawberries. EWG has got the 12 most dangerous. Don't buy strawberries, don't buy grapes. There are various fruits and vegetables you should not buy because they're chock full of pesticide and insecticide. Now, it's difficult. I agree. Not everybody in the world can have a degree in advanced toxicology, but experts can look at these things and they can create a little app on your iPhone and you can scan the foods that are being presented by this ghastly combine called the industrial food industry. And so there's a lot of people setting up now to inform you about how toxic it is or how sustainable it is or isn't. So this kind of information is inches away from us now. This kind of power is becoming available to the consumer. What is the fossil footprint of this particular product, of this running shoe as opposed to that running shoe, or this motor car as opposed to that motor car? So, this kind of consumer information is rapidly being mobilized by countless different groups, and they're creating these apps. And I think it's only a matter of time before a lot of those apps get synthesized into a kind of one real shopper app, and you can go around, and checking out all the different. And this is the point. Anybody who's selling products and they haven't got scannability which covers these things: sustainability, safety, health, ecological, disposal, whatever, their product is going to miss out because, automatically people will doubt whether it's safe. And these things are unsafe for the human future. So the information to make you an empowered consumer is coming. And I take great encouragement from that.
Yeah, that's a fantastic positive note on which to end. So I'm going to pass this over to Jean Doherty, the chairman of the board of the Canadian Association for the Club of Rome, to thank you.
Quite literally pass it over. Anyway, again, Julian, it definitely is my pleasure to thank you on behalf of KCOR for this very, very interesting and sobering presentation that you've given us. It's wonderful that you've been able to bring us this information on something that is so important for the survival of the human race. It's extremely important for us to get going on this particular topic. So with that, I'd like to thank you. And again, for those of you who are left and for those of you listening, I on tape, I would like to draw your attention to going to the KCOR website at canadiancore.com. There you will find information about our particular organization, but also if you go to the Stay Informed section on the KCOR website, you will see information about this particular talk, as well as all the other Zoom presentations that KCOR has had over the last 2 to 3 years. It's been wonderful, great resource for that. You'd find information about our organization. You would find information about how to become a member of KCOR if that's of interest to you. So again, thank you very much, Julian. This has been an absolutely fabulous presentation.
Thank you, Jean. Really appreciate it.
I have a couple